This woman sat inside an Ohio courtroom with a heavy expression, yet she still tried to keep herself calm. And that is exactly what made this case so much harder to accept. In court, the story this mother wanted people to believe was not a story of cruelty. It was covered in confused explanations, late tears, and an attempt to turn everything into an accidental tragedy inside a family that had been falling apart for a long time. Her baby boy had disappeared from the sight of the people who were supposed to monitor him. Appointments were missed. Required check-ins did not happen the way they were supposed to. And for a period of time, no one outside that home truly knew where the child was. At first, some people might have thought this was a case of poverty, addiction, loss of control, or a family that simply did not have the ability to care for their child. But when investigators began following the hidden details, that story quickly fell apart. Because the truth was not found in the trembling statements given in court. It was found in child welfare records. It was found in the unanswered attempts made by social workers to reach the family. It was found in forensic details that no defense argument could make disappear. And in the end, it was found in a cold place behind the home, where police discovered something no one wanted to believe was real. What you are about to see is how Jessica Groves tried to stand in court as a grieving mother, while layer after layer of evidence pulled the case in a completely different direction. A child too young to protect himself no longer had a voice. And when prosecutors laid out what really happened to Dylan Groves, the courtroom no longer saw this as an accident, a misunderstanding, or an ordinary family tragedy. Every detail in this case has been verified through court records, trial testimony, official investigation, and the sentence that was later handed down. This is one of those cases that outraged the public, not only because of what happened to a child, but also because of the larger question behind it. How could a baby who had once been under the watch of the child protection system disappear for so long? How could the warning signs still not be enough to prevent what happened? And how could a mother walk into court and try to tell her version of the story when the evidence in the case was pointing to a truth that was completely different? In this video, we will go through the full case of Jessica Groves and Dylan Groves, from the early days after Dylan was born, to the process that brought him back into the family's care, to the missed check-ins, and finally to the moment the investigation uncovered what his parents had tried to hide. If you have never heard the full story of this case before, prepare yourself, because what happened in Otway, Scioto County, Ohio, in 2019 was not just the story of a broken family. It was the story of a child left behind between promises, failures, conflicting statements, and a truth that left the entire courtroom silent. To understand why this mother was standing in that courtroom, and why the final sentence was so severe, we have to go back to the beginning before Dylan Groves disappeared, before police arrived at that home, and before the name Jessica Groves became one of the most disturbing names in Ohio family crime cases. Dylan Groves was born on the 10th of January 2019 at Southern Ohio Medical Center, and from the first hours of his life, his case was already under the attention of Scioto County Children's Services. He was the infant son of Jessica Groves and Daniel Groves, a couple living in the Otway area of Scioto County, Ohio. Dylan entered the world early, with breathing problems, and records later reviewed in court showed that his umbilical cord tested positive for multiple controlled substances. Jessica had not received prenatal care, and her behavior at the hospital raised concerns. Before Dylan could ever know what home was supposed to mean, the state was already involved. Because of those concerns, Dylan was first placed outside his parents' care. Foster mother Andrea Bowling cared for him during that early period. For a short time, Dylan was in a setting where people outside his family could see him, feed him, hold him, and watch his condition. But the goal of the case plan was reunification. On the 28th of January 2019, Dylan was returned to his father, Daniel Groves, under strict conditions. Jessica was not supposed to live in the home without supervision. The parents were expected to comply with treatment, court requirements, home visits, and medical appointments. On paper, the safety net remained in place. At first, that safety net appeared to be working. Caseworker Patricia Kraft visited the home on February 4 and again on the 25th of February 2019. During those visits, Dylan was seen alive. He was described as clean, appropriately dressed, and without visible injuries. To an outside worker entering for a scheduled check, The situation did not yet reveal the danger that would later define the case, but after those early visits, the pattern changed. The parents became harder to reach. Appointments were missed. Court hearings were missed. Medical checkups were missed. Each absence made Dylan harder to verify, and each excuse pushed the case farther away from direct supervision. The most important date in the timeline became the 28th of March, 2019. That was the last day Patricia Kraft saw Dylan alive during a home visit. After that day, no caseworker was able to lay eyes on him again. Children's Services kept trying. Kraft called, sent messages, left notices, went to the home, and told Daniel to bring Dylan to the agency. But Daniel offered shifting explanations. He said he was in Canton. He said the car was not working. He said he would bring the baby later. Days passed, and Dylan remained unseen. Inside the home, according to evidence later presented in court, something had gone terribly wrong. Jessica Groves would eventually admit that she caused the fatal injuries, but she called it an accident. Prosecutors and medical evidence told a much darker story. Dylan had serious injuries, including fractures in multiple parts of his small body, and some of those injuries appeared to be at different stages of healing. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death as homicidal violence of undetermined etiology. That finding did not point to a single, simple accident. It pointed to severe harm that had to be explained. Daniel Groves later testified that he found Dylan deceased in a pack-in play after the caseworker left on March 28. But even if the jury had accepted that part of the timeline, the next question was impossible to ignore. Daniel and Jessica did not call 911. They did not call Children's Services. They did not take Dylan to a hospital. They did not report what had happened. Instead, the evidence showed that the parents kept Dylan hidden from the people who were already looking for him. In this case, there was no public rescue call from a neighbor, no immediate emergency report from a family member, and no 911 call that led officers directly to Dylan. The investigation moved forward because Children's Services could no longer confirm that the infant was safe. On the 30th of April 2019, caseworker Patricia Kraft filed a missing person report with the Scioto County Sheriff's Department. That report turned a growing child welfare concern into a law enforcement search. Dylan was no longer only a child the agency needed to see. He was now a missing infant. Sheriff's deputies began trying to locate him. Children's Services and law enforcement went back to the Groves home more than once, but Dylan was not produced. The behavior of Jessica and Daniel only deepened suspicion. On the 20th of May 2019, Chief Deputy John Murphy saw them near the home on a four-wheeler. When he tried to approach, they ran into the woods. Officers were trying to find a baby. The parents were not helping. They were avoiding contact. By then, the agency had already taken custody of another child in the family, Daniel Jr., on April 24. The pressure around the Groves household was increasing. The missing infant report, the failed visits, the missed hearings, the missed medical appointments, and the refusal to show Dylan all pointed in the same direction. Investigators did not yet have the whole truth, but they had enough to know the situation was urgent. They needed access to the home, and they needed answers from the parents. On the 10th of June 2019, law enforcement executed a search warrant at the Groves residence. Jessica was taken into custody during that operation. Daniel did not surrender immediately. A standoff followed, lasting for hours before officers finally arrested him. At first, the case still centered on the concealment of Dylan from Children's Services and law enforcement, but the investigation was about to move into a far more serious stage. After the arrests, Daniel and Jessica were questioned. Full interrogation transcripts have not been released to the general public in ordinary news reports, but the court record and trial testimony show that Daniel was not immediately truthful with investigators. Eventually, he led authorities to the place where Dylan had been hidden. On the 12th of June 2019, investigators went to a well near the family property in Otway. The well was about 30 feet deep. What they found there changed the entire case. Dylan's body was recovered from the bottom of that well. He had been wrapped in plastic and duct tape, placed in milk crates, and secured with chains, padlocks, and zip ties. Reports also described the container as weighted down. Fire personnel assisted in bringing the remains up from the well. At that moment, the search for a missing infant became a homicide investigation. The question was no longer where Dylan was. The question was what his parents had done to him, and what they had done after he died. The evidence of concealment became one of the strongest parts of the case. This was not a child found in a crib after a reported emergency. This was an infant found at the bottom of a well, bound inside containers and hidden from every agency that had been looking for him. Prosecutors would later argue that those actions showed consciousness of guilt. Instead of calling for help, instead of telling the truth, Jessica and Daniel took steps to make Dylan disappear. The autopsy and medical testimony made the case even more devastating. Dylan had multiple fractures, including serious bone injuries and broken ribs. Evidence also showed the presence of controlled substances in his body. The medical examiner's conclusion, homicidal violence of undetermined etiology, became central at trial. The defense could argue about who did what and when, but the medical evidence showed that Dylan's death was not treated as an unexplained natural loss. It was treated as a criminal act. A grand jury later indicted Jessica and Daniel Groves on 11 counts, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, child endangering, tampering with evidence, interference with custody, gross abuse of a corpse, and multiple counts of felonious assault. Both pleaded not guilty in June 2019. The case then moved toward trial under the name OHV. Groves, the death of baby Dylan. A case preserved in court TV records through opening statements, witness testimony, defendant testimony, closing arguments, verdict, and sentencing. When the trial began in January 2020 in Scioto County, the courtroom heard a case that was both legal and deeply human. The prosecution told jurors that Dylan had been failed by the two people who should have protected him. Jessica was accused of directly causing the fatal injuries. Daniel was accused of failing to protect his son, failing to seek help, hiding Dylan's death, and helping conceal the body. The state did not ask jurors to see Daniel as an uninvolved bystander. They asked them to see him as a father with custody and responsibility. The defense strategy was unusual because Jessica's attorney did not try to claim she had no role. Instead, the defense acknowledged that Jessica caused the injuries that led to Dylan's death, while trying to separate Daniel from the act that ended Dylan's life. The argument was that Daniel helped conceal the body, but did not directly cause the fatal harm. That distinction became important because Daniel faced aggravated murder as well as other charges. The jury would have to decide not only what happened to Dylan, but how responsibility should be divided between the two parents. Witnesses filled in the record. Patricia Kraft testified about Children's Services involvement, home visits, missed contact, and the growing concern when Dylan could no longer be seen. Foster mother Andrea Bowling represented the short part of Dylan's life when he had been cared for outside the Groves' home. Law enforcement witnesses described the search, the warrants, the arrests, and the recovery from the well. Medical testimony described Dylan's injuries and the findings that supported the homicide determination. Then Jessica took the stand. She said Dylan's death was an accident. She admitted causing his death, but she denied that she meant to do it. When questioned about specific injuries, her answers did not fully explain the medical evidence. She said some injuries came from dropping Dylan, but other fractures were left unclear. Prosecutors pressed her on the number and nature of the injuries, and on the decision to wrap Dylan's body and hide him instead of reporting his death. The more she spoke, the harder it became to separate the claimed accident from the deliberate actions that followed. Daniel also testified. He said he found Dylan deceased in the pack-end play after a caseworker had left the home on March 28. He claimed Jessica told him that if they reported the death, he would be blamed because he had custody. He admitted parts of the concealment and admitted drug relapse later in the timeline, but prosecutors used his testimony, his missed obligations, his failure to produce Dylan, and his role in hiding the body to argue that he had not acted like a helpless parent. He had acted like someone trying to keep the truth from being discovered. The jury heard about another disturbing detail involving drug testing. Testimony showed that the older child, Daniel Jr., had provided urine samples for his father. Prosecutors used that evidence to challenge Daniel's presentation of himself and to show how the parents had tried to manage the system around them. In a case already built on missed visits and hidden facts, that testimony added another layer of deception. After the evidence closed, the jury deliberated for a little more than 2 hours. On the 10th of January 2020, the day that would have been Dylan's first birthday, the verdicts were read. Jessica Groves was found guilty on all 11 counts, including aggravated murder. Daniel Groves was found guilty on most of the charges, but not guilty of aggravated murder. That difference mattered legally, but it did not erase the jury's conclusion that Daniel had played a major role in what happened after Dylan disappeared from view. Sentencing followed immediately. Judge Mark Kuhn imposed life without the possibility of parole for Jessica Groves on the aggravated murder conviction, plus an additional 32 years for the remaining counts. Daniel Groves received 47 years to life. The courtroom also heard from Andrea Bowling, Dylan's foster mother, who delivered a victim impact statement. Jessica apologized and said she had failed as a mother. But by then, the sentence was no longer about regret. It was about accountability for an infant whose life had ended before his first birthday. The legal outcome was final and severe. Jessica Groves would spend her life in prison without parole, with extra years added to the sentence. Daniel Groves would face decades in prison before any possibility of release. In 2022, the Ohio 4th District Court of Appeals reviewed Jessica's appeal in State v. Groves and affirmed the major parts of the case record and conviction. The public trial, the verdict, and the sentences remained the defining legal outcome. The Dylan Groves case stands out because the danger did not begin with a body found in a well. It began at birth, when Dylan entered the world already marked by medical and child welfare concerns. It continued when he was returned to a parent under strict conditions. It deepened when visits were missed, calls went unanswered, and Dylan could no longer be seen. By the time investigators reached the well in June 2019, the system was no longer trying to prevent harm, it was trying to uncover what had already happened. For the jury, the evidence created a clear chain. Dylan was born into risk. He was placed under supervision. He was returned to Daniel. Caseworkers saw him briefly, then lost direct contact. The parents gave excuses. Law enforcement searched. Daniel eventually led investigators to the well. Medical evidence showed serious injuries. The body had been hidden with deliberate steps. Each piece alone was disturbing. Together, they formed the story of a baby who slipped from protection into danger, while the adults around him concealed the truth. In the end, the case was not only about what happened inside one home in Otway, it was about the fragile line between supervision and disappearance. Dylan was not a teenager who ran away. He was an infant, fully dependent on adults for every breath, every feeding, every appointment, and every sign of safety. When those adults failed him and then hid him, his life became a criminal case. And when the jury returned its verdicts, the courtroom record confirmed what the evidence had already shown. Dylan Groves had been a child under protection, but protection did not reach him in time. The strongest message from the Dylan Groves case is that a child can be under official protection and still fall through every gap when supervision becomes only paperwork. Dylan was not hidden from the system at birth. He was known to children's services, placed in foster care, returned under conditions, and then slowly moved beyond direct view. By the time investigators found him, the warnings had already turned into a criminal case. The lesson is that child protection cannot depend on missed appointments, unanswered calls, and promises that a parent will bring the child in later. When an infant cannot be seen, the danger must be treated as immediate. Every delay gives the wrong people more time to control the story, hide the truth, and keep a vulnerable child out of reach. This case also shows that responsibility does not end with the person who caused the final harm. Anyone trusted with a child's safety has a duty to act before silence becomes evidence. Dylan's life was brief, but his case remains a warning. Protection only matters when it reaches the child in time, before a home becomes a place where the truth is buried.